Mrs Pepperpot Turns Detective by Alf Proysen. Chapter 1. Mrs Pepperpot in the Magic Wood. Mrs Pepperpot, as you may remember, lives on a hillside in Norway. Behind her house there's an old fence with a gate in it. If you walk through that gate, says Mrs Pepperpot, you walk straight into the magic wood. It's really just a little copse with larch and spruce and birch trees, but in spring the ground is covered with snowdrops, the whitest carpet you ever saw, and round a big mossy stone a patch of violets make a bright splash of colour. The birch trees seem more silvery in here, and the pale green branches of the larch trees more feathery as they sway over the stream that trickles down the hillside. And in and out of the long grass the weasel has made a pattern of little winding paths. It is very beautiful. But Mrs Pepperpot likes it even better in the winter, when the magic wood has a thick carpet of snow and the icicles sparkle from the branches. Then all is silent except for the scrunch, scrunch of Mrs Pepperpot's boots as she walks through the snow. It was a day before Christmas, and Mrs Pepperpot had asked her husband to cut her a small Christmas tree in the magic wood. But he was so busy at his work that he hadn't time to do so. Mrs Pepperpot decided to take the axe and cut it down herself. As the snow was slippery, she took a stick with her. She soon reached the little fir tree, and after marking a circle around it with her stick, she lifted the axe to start chopping. Then the awful thing happened. You know, the thing that keeps happening to Mrs Pepperpot at the most inconvenient moments. She shrank to the size of a pepper pot. "I'll have to find a small stick," she said. "It'll help me to plough a path through the snow. Ah, well, I could be in a worse fix, I suppose. I ought to be used to it by now." "Hi!" shouted a small voice quite close above her. "What was that?" said Mrs Pepperpot, who'd nearly jumped out of her skin. She was so surprised. "It's me," said the little voice. And now Mrs Pepperpot could see a tiny boy, no bigger than herself, standing by her side. "Well, come on, don't just stand there. They're all sitting inside crying their hearts out because they think the ogre has eaten you. We must hurry home and surprise them." Without waiting for an answer, the little fellow bent down to a hole in the snow and started to crawl into it. "Well," thought Mrs Pepperpot, "I may as well go and see what this is all about. He seems to know me, even if I don't know him." She left the axe, and tucking the stick she'd found under her arm, she bravely crawled after the boy into the hole. It was quite a long tunnel, which led to a little door. The boy knocked, but from behind the door there was such a noise of wailing and weeping that at first no one answered his knock. But when he had knocked again, the bolt slid back, and the door was opened by a young girl with a ladle in her hand. The room was brightly lit by a fire over which hung a steaming pot. Mrs Pepperpot, who was hidden behind the boy in the dark tunnel, could see 3 people inside, and they were all looking most dejected as they went on with their crying. The little boy stamped his foot. "Stop that noise!" he shouted. you see I brought Betty Bodkin back?" And with that he took hold of Mrs. Pepperpot's arm and dragged her into the middle of the room. For a moment everyone stared at Mrs. Pepperpot, and then the wailing began afresh. "Little Dick, what have you done? This isn't Betty Bodkin," said the girl with the ladle. Little Dick turned and had a good look at Mrs. Pepperpot. Then he shook his fists at her and threw himself on the floor in what can only be described as a temper tantrum. But Mrs. Pepperpot had had enough of this nonsense. "When you've all finished your caterwauling," she said, "perhaps someone will tell me who you are and who I'm supposed to be. Then maybe I'll tell you who I really am." "It is a bit confusing," said a fat little man who sat nearest the fire. "We thought you were one of us, you see." "So I hear, but who are you?" Mrs. Pepperpot was losing patience. "Let me explain," said the girl with the ladle, and as no one tried to stop her, she continued. "You may not recognise us, but when you were little you knew us well enough. Do you remember your mother taking you on her lap sometimes to cut your nails? You probably didn't like it, and she would hold your hand and count your fingers one by one." "That's right," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "And then she would sing me a little ditty that went like this. Here is Thumbkin, fat and tubby. Here is Lickpot, always grubby. Long man next, he has his fiddle. Now Betty Bodkin with her needle, and little Dick who's just a tiddle." They all clapped their hands. "There you are," cried the girl. "You haven't forgotten. And that's who we are. The finger people who live in the magic wood. This is Thumbkin," she said, pointing to the fat little man by the fire. "Pleased to meet you," said Thumbkin, as Mrs. Pepperpot shook hands with him. "I used to find you a very comforting person," said Mrs. Pepperpot, smiling. "This is Longman, as you can see," went on the girl. But the tall, thin fellow was so shy he held his fiddle behind his back and looked as if he'd like to vanish right away. "I'm Lickpot. I do the cooking, you see," said the girl. Little Dick had now got over his disappointment. Taking another look at Mrs. Pepperpot, he said, "You're so very like Betty Bodkin." "Just what happened to Betty Bodkin?" asked Mrs. Pepperpot. Immediately they all started talking at once. "It was like this. We were out in the wood. We always wished the moon a happy Christmas. It was such a glorious night." "One at a time, please," said Mrs. Pepperpot, holding her ears. Lickpot raised her ladle to get order. "Quiet now. I'll explain. As they said, we went for a walk to greet the moon. Suddenly, a huge ogre came along the path, and we all had to rush into the tunnel to get out of his way. But Betty Bodkin tripped over her needle, and she didn't manage it. The ogre picked her up in his great hand and put her in his pocket. Now we're all so worried about what has happened to her, and Christmas won't be Christmas without Betty Bodkin." "Perhaps the ogre has eaten her all up," said little Dick, and he started to cry again. "Oh, ogres aren't as bad as they once were," said Mrs. Pepperpot to comfort him. "Besides, if she's as used to being small as I am, she'll know how to get out of tight corners. If only we could find where the ogre lives, then perhaps we could rescue her," said Lickpot. "I'm sure we could if we all pulled together," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "I think I have an idea where that ogre lives." "Will you show us the way?" asked little Dick excitedly, and they all crowded around Mrs. Pepperpot, tugging at her skirt. "There's no time to lose," she said, and immediately started crawling back through the tunnel. The others followed, but when they got outside they found the road blocked by an enormous snowdrift. never get through that," said Thumbkin, and looked quite ready to creep back inside to his warm fire. It was quite a problem, and Mrs. Pepperpot shut her eyes so as to think better. Suddenly she remembered something very important. They were in the magic wood, where wishes come true if you wish hard enough. "Quiet, everybody. I'm going to make a wish," she said. While they all stood very still, she touched the snowdrift with her stick and said loudly, "I wish this snowdrift to turn into a polar bear. A friendly polar bear who can carry us all on his back and take us to the ogre's house." As soon as she finished speaking, the snowdrift began to rise under them, and they found themselves sitting on a soft, warm, white rug. Then the rug began to move forward, and Mrs. Pepperpot could see 2 ears in front of her. She had ridden on a bear before, so she knew what bears liked most: to be tickled between the ears. Gingerly, she crawled towards the ears and perched herself between them. "Oh, do be careful," warned Lickpot, who was clinging with all her might to the bear's fur. Longman was so frightened he was lying full length with his face buried, but Thumbkin and Little Dick were beginning to enjoy themselves, looking all around from their high seat. When the bear felt his ears being tickled, he purred, or rather he rumbled, with content. And in no time at all he'd carried Mrs. Pepperpot and the Finger People to the edge of the wood, where there was a fence and a gate in it. "Open the gate with your muzzle," commanded Mrs. Pepperpot, and the big polar bear did just as she'd said and opened the gate. Then they came to a house with a lighted window. "Now I want you to lie down outside the door," said Mrs. Pepperpot, "and you must wait there till I come out again. Is that clear?" The great creature just nodded his head slowly and settled down on the doorstep. Mrs. Pepperpot turned to the Finger People. "I'm pretty certain that I'll find the ogre inside this house," she said. "Don't you want us to help you rescue Betty Bodkin?" asked Little Dick, who was feeling quite chirpy now. "No, thanks. I think I can manage this by myself," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "I just want you to wait here with Mr. Polar Bear. If Betty Bodkin is there, I'll bring her out to you, and then you can all go home." They all shook her hand warmly and wished her luck. "Trust in me," said Mrs. Pepperpot, and swung her leg over the doorsill. Just as she disappeared into the dark hall, she grew to her normal size and walked into the dining room. There sat Mr. Pepperpot. The tears were rolling down his cheeks, and his sharp nose was quite red with crying. On the table by his side stood a small doll's bed Mrs. Pepperpot had brought to give a little girl for Christmas. And in the bed lay Betty Bodkin, trying very hard to look like a doll. There were medicine bottles on the table as well, and a box of licorice pills. Mrs. Pepperpot put her hands on her hips and said, "Just what are you carrying on like this for?" At the sound of her voice, Mr. Pepperpot looked up. He couldn't believe his eyes. "Is that you? Is that really you, my own wife?" he cried, and caught hold of her skirt to see if she wasn't a ghost. "I thought I'd lost you this time. I was going through the woods searching for you when I saw—" He stopped and stared at the little old woman in the doll's bed. "But then who's this? I picked her up in the snow and I brought her home, thinking it was you who'd shrunk again." "You silly man, mixing me up with a doll that someone's dropped on the path," said Mrs. Pepperpot. Then, standing between him and the doll's bed, she carefully lifted Betty Bodkin up and wiped away the sticky medicine and licorice pills her husband had tried to dose her with. Betty was just about to thank her, but Mrs. Pepperpot made a sign for her to keep quiet and carried her towards the front door. But Mr. Pepperpot was so afraid that his wife might vanish once more that he followed, holding on to her coat. As she leaned out of the door, he asked, What are you putting the doll in the snowdrift for? To get her back where she belongs, said Mrs. Pepperpot. Come and have your supper now. Just a minute, I want to shovel the snowdrift away from the door first, Mr. Pepperpot said. Why, are you afraid it'll walk in? Come on now, supper's ready. So Mr. Pepperpot went into the kitchen to wash his hands and didn't hear his wife whisper to the snowdrift, Turn about, quick march, get them home as fast as you can. Later that night, when she was washing up, Mrs. Pepperpot amused herself by singing the old ditty. Here is Thumbkin, fat and tubby, here is Lickpot, always grubby, Long Man next, he has a fiddle, now Betty Bodkin with her needle, and little Dick, who's just a tiddle. The end.